world where achievements and accolades motivate us to do more and be more, we're often left wondering, is this really it?
Deep inside, you know there is more to life. You're ready to leave behind the old, push your way through, and claim the deeper life that's calling you.
That's where we excel.
We're your hosts, Stephanie Allen
and Maren Stephanie.
And this is the Soulful Leader Podcast.
Sit back and relax as we share the shortcuts we've uncovered to help you make shift happen.
Hi, welcome to the Soulful Leader Podcast. This is Stephanie Allen, and I'm here with Maren Stephanie, and we are so excited because we've just had a pretty extraordinary experience. We had a trip of a lifetime. Very few people get to go to a place called Sable Island, and we just had the opportunity to go and explore and be guided from some pretty sacred beings who respect and inspired us in so many ways. It was pretty amazing, wasn't it, Maren?
It was phenomenal. And so Sable Island is a place off the coast of Nova Scotia. And when I say off the coast, it's not like, oh, I can see Sable Island. We're talking like hours off the coast of Nova Scotia. And as an American, I was unaware of Sable Island. And I think that even a lot of Canadians, maybe, unless you're from the Maritimes, it was, when we think about going to an island, several people are like, oh, did you spend the night? And it's not that kind of an island. It is literally a sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's where shipwrecks and two different tidal current waves. I'm so ignorant when it comes to water. You should speak to that, Stephanie. But two different intersecting waves come in, and it just is this ecological, magical place that's unique. It's completely unique.
And it is so sensitive to what we as human beings do. And I'm not just about our own footprint, literally physically manifesting on that island. So there's very few people that actually get the opportunity to go to this island, but also just the sensitivity of what we are creating in the world. It gave me such an insight about what we're creating in this world is so felt and experienced in every place. And I know, science would say about electrons, and electrons being energy, is that, electrons travel through every living being within 12 to 13 days. And you could see the currents and the things that were happening on this island. And one of our guides that was there, her name's Zoe, she has been on the island for 50 years and has been so immersed in the mystical and the magical unveiling of possibilities of what this whole ecosystem and diversity is that was teaching her. And she was sharing her wisdom with us. And one of the things is that every day was like a treasure hunt. Every day she'd find something new. And right now she's cataloging plastics and looking at the brands and kind of following its journey. And I was really touched by that because, from myself personally, I have my own kind of stand to say we need to stop using plastics. We need to stop. And so I'm kind of a little bit on my kind of, get my picket sign out and say, anti-plastic kind of thing.
Right. But beat people up with it, right?
That's right. But she had integrated it so lovingly in a way that it wasn't about shame. She was just absolutely in awe and wonder of its journey and what it was, how it was traveling, where it came from and what it was doing. And she just adorable. Really enlightened me.
She to me, she almost seemed like a little kid on a discovery, like a discovery hunt. And it's a both and, because she very clearly knows the consequences and the big picture for what she's doing. And yet she holds it so lightly. And she get so excited about, she found this Esso, oil can plastic bottle thing from the 1950s, and she was showing it to us, and her eyes lit up like she was a little kid, like, ooh, and I found this, and it wasn't an excitement that was It was just such an earnest, true excitement for the discovery and the potential that people could learn from it, right?
And so I know for me, what I took away from that moment, I reflected inwardly and saying, here's something that is essentially, 70 years old, this little bottle, and it hadn't decomposed a whole lot. There was a little bit, but a little rough, but we really could identify what it was. And I related it to genetic line things or our culture, is that things happen in our past that we think, oh, well, that was in the past, it was long gone, but it resurfaces in our present moment. And so I'll give you an example. When I look at that, it's like there's patterns. There's patterns of in my genetic line that we keep returning to. I know my dad lost a business back in when he was in his early 30s. And it was a hard time economically and all these different things. And it's interesting that in my 30s, I had the exact same thing happen to me. And so sometimes we can see these patterns returning, or patterns on how I always say, I will not be like my mother. No way am I going to be like my mother. Now, I love my mother, but I don't want to be like her. I'm totally opposite. And next thing you know, the very words coming out of my mouth are exactly what my mother would say. And I catch myself, and it's like, that's just like this bottle, this SO bottle. It's like all of a sudden it emerges up, and you're like, oh, there's that little bottle again. I
I
thought it was
think,
gone.
yeah, I hear that because I'm going to relate it to our recent clutter podcast that we did and the work that we've done with William. And we shove things in the corners of our minds, of our hearts. We don't want to see them. We walk away from them, and we think that if we just move on, it will be forgotten. And it's not. It resurfaces, kind of like like that bottle that you're talking about, or something from our past. And I think of them as, and we've used this word before, this term of doorways, of opportunities. And we can take those opportunities when they resurface to start looking at it more consciously. And if we look at it just from a base flatland, kind of like, okay, so this bottle, this SO bottle, resurfaced, and what do we need to learn from that as a society, which I think is a whole lesson in and of itself, right? And we could be eco warriors, and I agree with you. I'm along those lines. I very strongly feel like we need less stuff in our lives. And then taking that to the deeper level, or maybe looking at it from a higher perspective of what is that also reflecting to me in my own life about places and things that I bury or that I walk away from, and they resurface in some way, shape, or form. And I can either continue to ignore it. Somebody mentions something, or somebody has a problem that like I had. I was recently talking to somebody, and they're, kind of having a tete-a-tete, like they're butting heads with an ex-spouse. And I don't have an ex-spouse, and my parents got divorced. And so there's this piece where that showed up in my life, and is that an opportunity for me to look at things at a deeper level of, is there something there for me that I could look at and bring it out of the shadow and get rid of the clutter and take a look at it and learn something, like we could learn something from the SO bottle.
It's such a good point, because it is an opportunity for learning. It's an opportunity for growth and transforming something. I had a very similar situation of something resurfacing with a client of mine. Years and years ago, I had a client who was just she was just 40, and she had stage 4 cancer, breast cancer. And she was on my table, and I was working with her, and I noticed that her nose was crooked. And I had never noticed this before. We were just working some body work, and I said, what happened to your nose? And she said, oh, when I was 16, I was playing basketball. The ball came down and broke my nose, and I had to go home. The school sent me home. And she goes, and I walked in on my father cheating. And I've hated him ever since then. She's her 40s. So you imagine that's however many years, 20, 24 years of literally hating something. And I said, do you think maybe that hating, that resentment you have towards your father, do you think maybe that might be a poison that might be contributing to possibly the cancer that you're experiencing? And she said, and this is her words, I would rather die than forgive my father. And I said,
Mm,
it just broke my heart, because I said, you
it's
know what,
powerful.
yeah, you may just do that. You like, how is that gonna, like, do you think that's gonna punish your father? But you're punishing yourself. I said, you have a 16-year-old daughter yourself right now. Don't you want to be there for her? You love her. We often think that because I don't see it, because it's in the past, I'm going to just move on. I'm just going to like divorce it, or leave that job, or not talk to somebody, or whatever, that it's no longer in your consciousness. It is, it's still there. And that anger, or that sadness, or that fear is literally manifesting in your cells, in your consciousness. It's clutter, it's plastic, it's eroding some sort of life force within you. And it's going to resurface somehow.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the other things that I really learned from the island that is directly related to this is the use of natural materials and versus the use of plastic. And one of the things that Zoe was talking about is how plastic, even when it breaks down, it actually doesn't fully break down because it's man-made. So there are minuscule, molecular level particles that birds are eating, and they're affecting them because they're not actually natural products. And so even when it becomes very fine and we can't even see it anymore, it still is affecting us. There's still an impact. And so what would it be like if we used more natural products? And so I'm going to use that same parallel of in the world itself, just flat land of like, okay, if we were able to do that, one of the things Zoe was talking about is the true cost of plastics on our environment. And if we took that into consideration of what is the cost of plastics in our environment, plastic would cost so much more than it does the expense because it takes so much energy to actually do something with it, of make it go away, of make it healthy or somehow. I don't even know that there's a way to do it. So there's a high cost to it, which means that the actual monetary value would go way up, and we would have to pay so much for plastic that we would go back to using natural materials. And as I think about that and take it on that inward journey that we were just doing of the cost of the toxins that, like the woman that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
who she is literally forfeiting her own life in order to hold the anger.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the toxin. And that anger is not a natural thing, it's a man made product. We don't have to go down that road. We can experience anger and then let it go.
And that's the
So,
key. And that's the key.
yeah,
We need to experience it. We need to let it out. Otherwise, and there's ways that we can let it out that can become transformational, not only for us, but also for those that we are connected to. I think of the other paradigm of being on Sable Island is that we saw the remains of many of the horses that have, that had passed away. And here are their decomposing bodies that were actually giving back life.
it was
It
amazing.
was amazing. It's like that's where the most fertile land was, where the horses had passed away. And it's like, nothing is ever wasted, especially so, if we've had relationships in our lives, or we've had a past that's been really hard or challenging, nothing's wasted. You're still conscious enough to remember it, then we can, as we feel it, we heal it, not only for ourselves, but for all of those in the environment around us. And then some, like I said about the electrons, those electrons then get transformed and then get radiated out to every living being in 12 to 13 days on the entire planet. That's amazing. That is the way that we can make a difference.
So, you just brought up something that I think a lot of our audience may not be aware of. So, go a little bit more deeply into that whole electron thing. What do you mean by that?
So electrons are energy, or electron, when you think of like a like a cell. There's protons and neutrons and electrons. It's kind of science in that way. And it's like electrons, they have no idea how to tell time. They don't know if it's past, present, or future. They're part of this whole kind of reality and universe, multidimensional. So anything that's ever existed in our past or anything that's existing in our future. Now that's a little bit kind of hard to digest. I know, right, some of you, but it's like, this is why we say it's so important to find an intention of where do you want to go? Who do you want to be? What is your ideal? Because when you start to tune in that, you are actually gathering those electrons from the future that will help to reinform you. I know this is like really big science project, but there's so much research on that. And I invite you to look into that. And I think that's what I found my experience with Zoe is that she could see the value of plastics in the way of the future. If we really honor it and respect it, we need it. Like for surgeons with the plastic, gloves and things like that. There's so many wonderful things that plastic can do, but to give it in the right context. So she's shifting a reality. She's creating an electron world where she can tune into the possibility of the ideal.
Yeah.
You know?
And that I agree. The other piece for me with Zoe is that it didn't come from that shame place of plastic have no place in our world and we should let go of them and they should be banned or whatever. It came from a place of what's the value? There
Right.
is value in plastics, and if we truly did value it the way that we should, they would be much more expensive, and we would use other materials for plastic bags and nylon things and et cetera, et cetera. We would use it for what is really important, and then we wouldn't have so much of the waste in our society. And I'm going to go back to that inner place of where do we do that for ourselves? Or where do we not do that for ourselves, where we're not valuing something? And we've talked before about our gifts and our strengths, and maybe this is where it's going, is that we don't value our own gifts and strengths. We take them for granted. And then our society teaches us that we're supposed to go work on our weaknesses,
Yeah,
in
to
school.
focus on our lack so that we
Correct.
can constantly feel like there's not enough.
Or we're not good enough. And so we're doing the same thing to ourselves that we're doing to our planets, and it's not unusual, right, to see this, because one of the things that we're sharing with this podcast is that what's happening on the outer is happening there for a reason, because it's also happening on the inner, and that inner plane where we can really shift something both on the outer and the inner is taking a moment and going, am I giving this the true value that it's worth? Me. Can I look at my own worthiness and say, hey, I'm worthwhile, and in all of these places, you know?
And to do it with love. And then that's, love is what heals. It's not shame. Shame is only going to repunish us and make us feel even worse. It's like, what if everything was perfect? That everything that wherever you are right now in your life, everything that has happened up to this point was absolutely perfect to bring you here, to bring you now to be listening to this podcast.
So before, it sounds like you might be headed towards an ending, and I'm not ready to end yet. I wanted to kind of come back full circle a little bit to the electrons and the healing. And I know that you explained really well about each of our organs, and actually our entire being regenerates. And this is something I think a lot of people don't know, is that the actual physical regenerates regularly. So could you talk about that?
Yeah. So what's really fascinating, it's like if someone gets a diagnosis, say with liver cancer or pancreatic cancer, there's usually a timeline. People will say, you've got 6 weeks to live if you have liver cancer, or you have a very short time to live if you have pancreatic. So how do they determine that? Science knows that every cell in your being completely turns over at a certain different rate. Each cell has a different rate, has a different intention. Liver cells constantly replenish themselves every 6 weeks. A pancreatic cell every 24 hours. So essentially you have a brand new pancreas every 24 hours, brand new. And part of you
So,
can kind of go, what?
yeah,
Right? Like
exactly.
what? And it's like, so if you have an illness in your pancreas, if it's not functioning well, then why, and I just wait 2 days and I got a brand new pancreas, no big deal. And this is what we talk about the electrons. We talk about consciousness. We talk about what's called the field or the electromagnetic field, which is where all possibilities exist in. This is where all energy relies. And if you ever rub your feet against the floor and then you go to touch your doorknob and you get a shock before you actually touch it, it's like we know that there's something transferring. There's something bigger than just our physical form. This is what your experience is, the actual electromagnetic field. So in that field of information, what we would call memes are to your field as genes would be to your body. So we talk about social media memes, like, when we had that Bernie Sanders meme that was going around, which was really quite funny. But we have also negative memes that go around too that aren't always true. But if you give it enough time and attention, it becomes a true. So this is why it's so important to, like, what are we giving attention to? What are we putting in our clutter and just not looking at? And what are we focusing on? And are we focusing on something with love and kindness? Or are we focusing on something with shame and hate and resentment and all these different things? Because you're actually giving it energy. You're actually giving it form. So coming back to the pancreas and the liver, is that why it doesn't heal within 24 hours is that you have to do a lot of consciousness work of, like, what might be making this cell dis-ease? What thought, belief, emotion, attitude? It could be yours. It could be something you've taken on in your field. Because, by the way, just like our genes we inherit from our genetic line, we also inherit our memes, the thought forms. So if you have a thought form that goes way back in time with your great, great, great grandparents that says, I'm not enough, or it's not safe, I need to have more money, more time, more energy, more love. And so you're, that meme has you basically going out consumptioning, like gathering more, protect more, clutter, 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 plastic, 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 all these different things, work, 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 right?
Right.
Then it literally clogs up your consciousness, and that creates dis-ease. So it takes a lot of work, absolutely. And it is amazing, because as you start, just like when you clean out your closet, like we did in our podcast, when you start to clean out a drawer, or if you look at one room, for example, when you look at a whole room and you're like, oh my gosh, this whole room is so cluttered, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel exhausting. It takes energy. It takes time. But if you just narrow it down to say, just today, I'm going to do the top drawer on the left-hand side of my dresser. That's it. I'm just going to do one drawer. And the next day you say, I'm going to do another drawer. And the next day you do another drawer. Next thing you know, that whole room starts to get cleared out. And all of a sudden you have so much more energy. It feels better. It feels lighter. This is also true of our internal world. If we can start to just take one thought and say, where did I collect that? Whose
And
thought
is
is
it
it?
even mine? Right. It might not
Exactly.
even be mine. And if it is mine, who else, as I heal it, as I address that thought and change my choice, right? I'm in choice around whether, and that puts me in choice. Having this space puts us in choice around whether I want to keep that thought. And here's the good news is when I start to digest that and make it so, like, oh, you know what? I don't need that anymore. I don't need to live in lack anymore. I don't need to believe that I'm not worthy anymore. I don't need to believe that I need to work 72 hours a week anymore. All of those things, as I start to digest that, it will impact others, especially those in my genetic line and or those in my stewardship. And when we're talking to leaders, and as leaders, the people that we end up having around us, they're attracted to us. We are their stewards, right? We are all in stewardship in relationship to each other. So there's an impact, them to us and us to them. It can make a difference.
And when we can do it together, it doesn't have to be lonely. It can be such a mirror of that we are all helping each other. We all have
Yeah.
each other's back.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of doing things. And it's going to bring me back around to Zoe at Sable Island, because she is very much about engaging everybody. And you just mentioned about cleaning out drawers and, cleaning out spaces and how it can be overwhelming to do too much. We, at the end of our time there, Stephanie and I asked her a question of if she could help make people more aware of their impact on the environment and on life as we know it. What would the question be that she would ask? And so we wanted to share that with you. We actually recorded Zoe herself sharing that, and I found it quite impactful and quite lovely and very much in line with what we're talking about today.
And recently, Maren, just before we went to Sable Island, we watched a program, and one of the programs was on science. And it said, science is great at solving problems. They love it. That's what science is all about, is how to solve a problem. But it takes a real genius to ask a question.
Yeah.
And it's not a question, it's the question. So I think this is a perfect place to leave it, because we did ask a question, and we asked So to leave us with the question. And so please stay tuned and listen to the end of this, and we will be love to hear your comments about what you're going to do with the question that she asks.
Yeah, there's definitely she's great because there's a call to action at the end. And so please post in our blog. And if you want to visit the Sable Island Institute, post for her too. She would like to get at least 10 of you out there. And I know there's a lot more listening to us. So 10 of you who would be willing to do her little exercise and report back. So that would be great if you could engage yourselves and be a part of making a difference on our planet. All right, we've got a question for you. Stephanie and I do a podcast, and if you had one question that you could ask people to get them to think differently and get them to be more aware, what would the question that you would ask them be?
You mean ask them to do something, you mean? Like,
or to think about, or something like that, that would actually shift their way of being.
I think it would be a really interesting thing if people just sort of took a couple hours and looked around their kitchen or their home and just make a list of all the plastic stuff in one room. The whole house might be a lot, but like all the plastic stuff, like the containers, and the plastics. I mean, it's not like it's like synthetics, like PVC. I mean, this is a bag, but that's actually plastics. It's not fabric anymore. It's not natural fibers.
Right.
So just go through your stuff and see what's synthetic, what's plastics, what's neoprene, and you have to get that complicated, but plastics. And I think it would be a really interesting project, really, for people to see how much they have. And, maybe how much do they actually need of all this stuff? Because basically it all ends up in the environment. No matter what you do with it, whether you recycle or whatever, basically one way or another, it's going to have consequences for the environment because it exists.
So the big thing would be is to ask them, like, be conscious about what you've got, and do you need all this, and what can what can you say no to, so that you can make a difference in the world.
And reduce. It was always the 3 R's. They were reduce, reuse, and recycle. Basically, reduce is the most important one. Reuse is okay. Recycle is not so much. Yeah. Because it's recycling. For the most part, we know that it's not functioning quite like it should. But it also, when it does, it still requires energy. It consumes energy to convert and whatnot. So, anyway, I think that would be pretty interesting to see the results of that. It would be pretty interesting to get responses from people too. Maybe
that'd be great. They could reach out to you and let you know their own personal experiment.
Yeah.
And what they've changed.
It would be actually an interesting, if you could get something like that going, and maybe getting 10 people to take it seriously and do it, to actually put the results together. We can post them on the website on our, sort of connected with the plastic monitoring page.
Love it.
That would be great.
Or in your blog, but one way or another, to actually see if you could get that done and get people to provide the results.
The Soulful Leader Podcast activists.
Thank you.
That's a good idea.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for taking its time to listening and dropping in and doing your inner clutter.
We'll see you next week.
And that wraps up another episode of the Soulful Leader podcast with your hosts, Stephanie Allen
and Maren Oslack. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to dive deeper, head over to our website at thesoulfulleaderpodcast.com.
Until next time.